Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute or so. If you want to take a look at the left-hand panel of your webinar toolbar, you'll see that we have 4 handouts that you might choose to download while you're waiting just another minute for us to get started here. Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started here. Jenny, you want to go ahead and kick us off?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's Core Advocate webinar, Building Fluent Readers. We're excited to have you all with us for a great webinar that we have in store for you this evening. Your hosts for the evening are going to be from the Field Impact team, Sandra Alberti, Janelle Fan, and myself, Jenny Beltramini. We are also excited that our guests this month are Student Achievement Partners Literacy Team's David Lieben and Core Advocate Lorraine Griffith. So core advocates, who are they? You are all core advocates because you are on the webinar with us this evening. But core advocates are educators of all types, teachers, administrators, and everything in between, who believe in the potential of college and career-ready standards to prepare all students for college and careers. They're eager to support colleagues and their communities in understanding and advocating for Common Core or college career-ready aligned instruction, and they understand and embrace the instructional shifts that are required by college and career-ready standards. So if you want to know more about our Core Advocate Network, we'd love for you to join our network if you haven't already. You can visit achievethecore.org, but you could also contact myself or my colleague Joni Thunderberg. And in addition, there's a link on this slide to sign up to become a Core Advocate by taking our survey. And at the end of this webinar, you will get this PowerPoint in an email, and all of the hyperlinks are active, so you can just click on that achievethecore.org/Core Advocate sign up. So we also, for those of you who have not joined us on webinars before, we have quite a group of people that live tweet during our webinars, so we would love for you to engage with us that way in addition to being on the webinar. You can use live tweet at achievethecore.org, and also my colleague Joni Thunderberg and Sandra Alberti and myself, our Twitter handles are there, and we ask you to use the hashtag Core Advocates when you're tweeting tonight. And just a couple of logistics about our webinars this evening. During the webinar, you can access documents that we have, handouts, by using the Handouts tab on the right-hand panel of your webinar. Also, we'll be asking you some questions during the webinar, and we will also be asking you to take some polls. So there's a questions tab there and also a polls tab. If you are Just so you know, when you answer questions, not everybody can see the answers, but we will be sending out some of the answers as we're monitoring them. Also, after the webinar, we will be sending you a survey to ask you about your participation on the webinar and what worked well for you and any suggestions you have for us. We would love your feedback and appreciate the time you take to take that short survey so that we can get better and continue to meet the needs of our core advocates during these webinars. Also, you will get access to the recorded webinar and all the materials in that email as well. And finally, we'd like to talk about instructional advocacy. So we pride ourselves on building webinars that not only are packed with information and tools and resources, and we see this as a learning opportunity for our core advocates, but we also hope that everybody that joins our webinars feel the urgency to take action based on what they learned and some of the tools and resources that they heard about during the webinar. So instructional advocacy is something that we have sort of coined, and it is educators who are grounded in a firm understanding of the shifts. They own, support, and promote the resources, tools, and practices that create learning environments in which students develop college and career readiness. So we hope that at the end of this webinar, you will learn some things that you will be able to go back to your classrooms, go back to your schools and districts, share with other colleagues, and implement in your classrooms so that you are taking action and being instructional advocates. And just one more thing about instructional advocacy. One of the ways that we measure our impact and whether or not the webinars that we do and all of the things that we do on the Field Impact team is having an impact in classrooms with students is we ask all of our core advocates to tell us about the things that they're doing. So what types of actions were you able to take back and do in your settings? Were you able to share tools, resources? Were you able to implement something in a lesson plan? And so we have this short, very brief instructional advocacy action form. We encourage you to fill it out as many times as you want to for every time that you do something in your classrooms or in your schools or districts using our tools and resources and the knowledge that you gain from this webinar. So there's the link to that form, and again, this will be hyperlinked in the PowerPoint that you get at the end of this webinar.
Okay, so as we always try to do in these webinars, we have three kind of areas that we're going to focus in on for tonight's webinar. The first one is we're going to start by kind of just talking about fluency and why it's important at all. Then we have some great examples and discussion around what teachers can do about this fluency in their classrooms. And then finally, we are going to end with sharing some specific tools and resources that are available to all of you to support this work. So we'd like to first start off with David Lieben talking about fluency and why it's important.
Okay, fluency is essentially the ability to read grade level text with accuracy, automaticity, and expression. Automaticity meaning pretty much automatic, and expression meaning what you would think it means, expression. I emphasize grade level because to be a fluent reader, you need to be reading text at the grade level or in the Common Core band level that fits your grade. And you're not fluent if you're in the 5th grade and you're able to read the 2nd or 3rd grade text with fluency. And this seems obvious, but what I've seen in a number of schools and a number of districts, if they're using a traditional Finus and Pinnell type program, a student might be at level N and they're fluent at level N, but level N might be 2 years below grade level, roughly where they are. So of course they're going to be fluent at the level that they're at, but to be a fluent reader, we're talking about students who are fluent at their grade level. Okay, next slide. Okay, so why is fluency important? Take a look at these bullets for one moment, please, and then we'll go over each one. Okay, reading too slowly makes comprehension far more difficult, and especially if the text is complex. And if you don't have automaticity, you're not going to be reading at the right rate. So reading too slowly is a problem. Poor word recognition. When you look at a word and you think it's flight, when it's really fight, you get a very different sense of the text. So poor word recognition makes comprehension far more difficult. And the combination of poor word recognition, inaccuracy in decoding, and slowness in decoding makes comprehension even more difficult. And again, this is particularly true with complex text. The Common Core standards call for more complex text than we used to have to deal with. And complex text means more difficult vocabulary. More difficult vocabulary often means more multisyllabic words. And complex text also means more complex syntax or more complex sentences. And both of those are obstacles to students who are not fluent. The other reason why fluency is so important is that research shows very clearly that students who are on track to be college and career ready need to learn about 2,500 to 3,000 words a year. You don't learn 2,500 to 3,000 words a year by vocabulary exercises, by vocabulary games, or even by discussions or lessons on vocabulary and context. The only way you learn this many words is by reading. And if you're not fluent, you don't understand what you read. And if you don't understand what you read, you're not learning the meaning of new words. I would add to that that knowledge works the same way. We still gain more knowledge from reading, whether it's on a screen or on paper, than we do from any other format when we can read with comprehension. But if you're not fluent, you can't read with comprehension. And therefore, you don't acquire the knowledge that you need. You don't acquire the vocabulary that you need. Slight addendum, the 2,500 to 3,000 words a year kicks in about third grade. The figure that students are learning in first and second grade is closer to 1,000 to 1,500. This affects all subjects. If you're not reading with fluency, you don't comprehend, and that's not, you're going to be unable to read science text. You're going to be unable to read social studies text or history text. You're going to be unable to read technology text. So if you don't become fluent, everything becomes quite an obstacle. Okay, next slide. Accumaticity. Accumaticity essentially is words correct per minute. How many words a student reads correctly in 1 minute. And many of you are probably familiar with WCPM. The term accumaticity comes from the work of a literacy researcher and professor in Louisville, Kentucky, named David Page, a colleague and a friend of mine. And he coined this for a number of reasons, but primarily, people make the mistake that if you read at the right rate of words correct per minute, then you're fluent. But fluency involves expression also. And without accumaticity, if you're not reading the right number of words correct per minute, you're not going to be fluent. But accumaticity does not guarantee fluency. Accumaticity is necessary for fluency, but it's not sufficient. If you can't read at the right rate and you're not reading words accurately, you're not very likely to be fluent. So without accumaticity, fluency is impossible. And again, accumaticity is necessary, but not proficient to be fluent. Okay, next slide.
So now we have a poll. How many listeners out there work within the following grade bands? Please use the poll that will come up on your screen momentarily to answer that question.
So as we assumed with the topic of fluency, we have primarily an elementary group here, but hopefully those of you who are even in the secondary grade bands, you'll see that what we're going to be sharing with you is certainly relevant K-12. And so related to this is our next question. Which is within your setting, do you actually have a routine for fluency? This is a simple yes, no. Okay, so it's a close one between almost half and half between those of you who have a routine and those of you who don't. And again, as we were preparing for this presentation, we're going to predict that most of you who say no are probably in the 6 to 12 grade band. But we'll see how that goes going forward. And as you put questions in later on in the webinar or comments and that kind of thing, it would be helpful to indicate your grade band just so we know a little bit more about your specific context. Okay. So now we're going to talk about how can teachers actually do the work of supporting students in building fluency. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you our core advocate guest speaker, Lorraine Griffith. So Lorraine, you want to tell us a little bit more about yourself, please?
Sure. I am so happy to be here. I got into teaching probably almost recently retired for 27 years. I taught in the classroom in kindergarten, 4th grade, 5th grade, and then I shifted over to work as a reading specialist in K-4. Almost for the last about 10 years, I've been working with on a contract basis or just volunteering at Great Minds in DC. So I've been also watching from a national level the way the Common Core standards have been put into classrooms. And with the latest work that we've done, we just came out with our own ELA curriculum called Wit and Wisdom. And that's the work that I've been doing. I only went full-time with Great Minds 8 months ago, so I still feel so connected to the classroom. And I'm excited to be here and to talk about this amazing set of routines for fluency. So a number of years ago, probably around 2002, something like that, it was a hot summer day, and I had signed up for one of those PDs in July that you live to regret, because as it's coming, you think, oh my gosh, I'm the county office. And there was this guy coming to speak. His name was Tim Rosinski, and I went to hear him, and for the whole first part of the day, he talked about how to work with struggling readers. It was good. And I went to lunch, and I thought, okay, I'll go back after lunch. And when I got back after lunch, he said, okay, now I'm going to tell you about reading. And from the moment, I don't even remember the rest of that afternoon, it opened my brain to this different kind of way to deal with my struggling readers. And I was just at this point of frustration of feeling like I do everything I possibly can. How can I help them? So one of the challenges that he put out there was theater with children. It really works on their expression. It works on their dramatic flair. It helps them to be comfortable in front of others. But most of all, it makes reading fun. So he challenged us to think about doing Reader's Theater scripts, and he used a second grade study that talked about these second graders that went up multiple grade levels during their second grade year in very short periods of time, and basically described it as the low-hanging fruit, that this is a way to get your students to working very, very closely with text. So as I went back to my classroom, I thought, okay, where am I going to find these scripts? So I scrounged the internet. I arranged some of my own things, and on the first day of school, I started handing out reader theater scripts to my students. I assigned them on Monday. They took them home, studied their part Monday through Thursday. On Friday, they performed with a group. I gave them some time to practice, and they performed. We made it fun. It was like a classroom theater. We had the students do refreshments, and they loved it. And this whole joy happened in my classroom. And while the other students in the school were experiencing Fun Friday, where they were making pudding and playing games outside, my students were using the same time that I'd always spent on Friday, and they were practicing reading out loud. The first year went great, and I sent an email to Tim Rosinski, not thinking he would ever write back, and I said, oh my gosh, my first year has been amazing. And he said, could you try it for a second year? So I thought, okay. So I studied during the summer and realized that some of the timed reads that I'd been doing just to collect data, I could also use in a different way to have the students actually practice timed reads and think about the phrasing while they were reading. Because one of the things that we learned was that the better the students phrased, the better their rate was, the better the comprehension was, and the more they learned how to read like a teacher or how to read with expression like an actor. So the second year, we did both readers theater and the timed reads. At the end of the second year, I wrote to Tim Rosinski and I said, year 2 was great. I have great data. And he said, do you think you could do it for another year? So the next year we kind of just went crazy. And the students started to show this deep interest in finding their own pieces to perform. So I had students look on the back of journal type books, like the Dear America series was really big then. And they would read a journal entry because it was written in first person. Or students would ask me for speeches. Or students would ask, you know, hey, can I use this, I found a script for a movie on TV. I didn't even know they had these, but he found the conversation between Gollum and his good side, Smeagol, and actually typed out the entire, I guess he listened to it and typed it out, typed out the entire part and then performed it. And he did it week after week after week until he felt like it was beautiful. I'll never forget that kid. I mean, it was completely amazing. Then we also did partner reading every time in the classroom that we had the opportunity. When I saw a good place in the curriculum or in a text where students could practice reading together using different voices for different characters, I would have them do that, and we continued the timed reads. At the end of the 3 years, there were some really amazing results. One of the greatest results at the end of that 3-year study was the pure joy that was in my classroom. The joy on kids' faces when they were only in 4th grade, but they were performing The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. We did it once for an audience of Title I teachers that had come to my school, and after it was all over, one of the Title I teachers came up to me and said, I had Cynthia in my class. I can't believe she just read that. And she had transferred from another school that year. She was an ESL student. And she said, I can't believe she read it. But you know what I noticed that I could not believe? She didn't just read her lines. She mouthed every single word of the entire poem. Now, those kids were in 4th grade, and I'm not sure exactly. It's hard to figure lexile on poetry, but I think that's traditionally thought of as being a high school poem. And my 4th graders had performed it beautifully. The average gain for my students before I started doing fluency in my classroom was good. My struggling students were going up more than a year, and for that I was very grateful. But they weren't getting to grade level. By the time they're in 4th grade, if they're 2 years below grade level and they go up a year, they're still going up to the next grade level 2 years behind. At the end of the study, the struggling students averaged a gain of 2.87, which was more than double what they did before. I went from having 22% of my students reading on grade level at the end of 4th grade to having 93% of my students ready to hit 5th grade. That to me was huge success. And at the end of that 3-year study, Tim Rosinski finally said, let's publish this. So we went back and we looked at all of the data from the years before. We went back into the archives and gathered it so we could do a comparative study. and had it published in the Reading Teacher. That's one of the resources that we have available for you today. As we move to the next slide, I want to show you what I've learned since that study. That was, I think that was published in 2005, and that wasn't the end of working with Fluency. One of the things that I've learned to really love, and Tim has started doing as a major part of his presentations on reading fluency, is to work with songs. Students automatically get swept into the melody of a song. You don't have to ask a child to sing a song over again. If it was catchy and they liked it, it's an automatic thing we all do. We very rarely sing a song once. So it's a natural, organic way of doing repeated reading. The most important thing when you do songs is to make sure that you put them up on PowerPoint, or that the students have a song sheet in front of them so that they can follow along. One of the most natural things with songs is that the rhythm doesn't wait for students, so it works on their pace. And their eyes have to learn to move more quickly over the words as they read. One of the things that I've really seen success with are the English learners, especially the young ones. Kindergarten, first, and second graders love to sing songs. And it's really poetry put to music. If you look for the ones that are in public domain, you'll find that there's a very high level of vocabulary in those songs. And so students are learning multisyllabic words at a very early age, and by seeing them and viewing them and having word analysis conversations while they're looking at those PowerPoint, you can really extend the phonics learning that they have in their classroom going on. The second thing that I have fallen in love with is reading interpretive poetry. One of the best hints that a high school teacher gave me one time was to teach children to read to the punctuation. And by using two different colors of highlighter, if you take any poem, like for example, if you took Robert Frost's poem, Two Roads Diverged in a Yellow Wood, and you go through that poem with your students and you say, okay, I see a comma. Let's first use our yellow highlighter and highlight two roads diverged in a yellow wood. Then we're going to use our blue highlighter and highlight the next part. And sorry, I could not travel both and be one traveler. Already we've been teaching the students that the thought doesn't end at the end of the line, but the thought ends at the punctuation. And by alternating two colors of a highlighter, you're really helping students to see how in a well-punctuated poem, they're getting the comprehension because of the way they're reading it. And poetry's fun. Break out some Jack Prelutsky or Shel Silverstein, and kids absolutely love reading it. One of the great treasures out there is the Paul Fleischman series, Joyful Noise, which is an entire book just about insects, but they're all poems for two voices written in the most creative way. My students have had so much fun with that book that I actually had seniors in high school come back and perform for my fourth graders the ones that they learned, because they had cemented them so much in their head while they were learning them and reading them over and over and over again. And finally, probably the most easy thing, especially for all of the core advocates that are listening today, are really thinking about how the shift for ELA can be accomplished in a way by using passages right out of complex text. So first of all, you're choosing a complex text to practice with, and the academic language that you want students to hone is in that text. So that's one of the shifts. The students are realizing, I can read this. The next one is if you choose passages from books that build knowledge, and the children are reading it over and over and over again, whether it's a speech, the actual words of Chief Joseph or Martin Luther King or John F. Kennedy, or if you're reading a passage from a fictional book that is set in history and the students are learning to empathize with a character, students are actually building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction or fiction. And then the last one is evidence from text. You know, when we give our students the assignment to read, speak, or write using evidence, for some of them, when they look back into a novel, they just think, I'll never find evidence in this novel. But if they have a collection of passages that they've read over and over and over again, they'll remember that passage, and they'll remember that there's at least one piece of evidence that maybe they can use in the paper that they're writing. And the more carefully that you choose that passage, the more you can front load it for those struggling students. So those are just some of the ways that I've worked in the past, and the ways that the longer that I worked on it, it actually became easier and more joyful.
Okay, David, you're on to the conversation on the K2 piece.
Thank you. All right, so how do we get students to fluency work in the early grades? The first part is Accumaticity in K-2 is essential. Accumaticity, again, being the accuracy of students decoding and the rate of students decoding, a combination of accurate and automatic. A student who's on track to be college and career ready should recognize words in 0.23 seconds. Now, just take a moment and try to visualize or understand how fast 0.23 seconds is. It's very fast. A quarter of a second is very fast. And students who are on track by the time they reach roughly the third grade should be reading most words in about a quarter of a second. So automaticity is not to be taken lightly. As you teach students to decode words in K-2, they should be able to decode those words quite quickly if they're going to be on track. So there's some recent research on Accumaticity. David Page, a colleague and friend of mine, who's an ed professor in Louisiana, has worked with students in 10 states with more than 10,000 students. And in this work, he has found that in looking at students' fluency, are they fluent enough to read a grade level text with enough fluency so that they could comprehend it? And he found that the numbers were, in these classes with 10,000 kids, between 25 and 70% of the kids were not fluent. And what that means is the number of words that they read per minute. So was too low. So for example, the average number of words correct per minute in a certain grade level in third grade is roughly on a national level about 120, based on research. So if you're in the bottom quartile of that, the bottom 25%, you might be reading words at 40 or 50 words per minute. And it turns out that kids who are in the bottom quartile can't comprehend. So in other words, the lower the percentage, the less fluent they are, the less they comprehend. And in this research with over 10,000 students, in each school, between 25 and 70% of students were not fluent enough with grade level text to be able to understand what they read. And the higher the grade, the more disfluent they were. So the larger numbers with 50 or 60% students disfluent were in the higher grades. Well, disfluent is measured by words correct per minute. And what that meant is that these students had low words correct per minute, which means that in K-2, when they were learning to decode, they did not learn to decode with enough accuracy and enough speed to be able to read with fluency. Because without Accumaticity, you cannot read with fluency. So how did we get to this problem? How did we get to the situation where such a large sample of students have a low words correct per minute or low Accumaticity? It has to be that instruction with these students did not succeed in decoding in K1 and 2. Well, why not? This goes back to the issue of how much phonics to teach in a foundational skills program and how much time to spend on phonics in a foundational skills program. And our foundational skills programs now, whether they're in basal readers, such as Journeys or Wonders or the new Pearson, Ready Gen, do not provide, either they do not provide enough time and focus on structured phonics, or teachers don't do it as much as they need to. So structured phonics is the idea that phonics lessons are laid out in a sequence. Initial consonants, final consonants, short vowel sounds, longer vowel sounds, vowel digraphs when two vowels together make a sound, such as AI making A or EA making E. That kind of structured phonics approach has produced better results in numerous research studies along the line of hundreds. The most well-known being the National Reading Panel. And the National Reading Panel showed, it was a study of studies, what's called a meta-study. And it took hundreds of studies and showed that in K1 and 2, students who were in a structured phonics program scored far better than students who were not in a structured phonics program. And again, this is hundreds of studies. Interestingly, the same type of study was done in the United Kingdom, where again, they took hundreds of studies from England and Ireland and Scotland and Wales. And once again, students in schools where they had a structured phonics program outperformed students who were not in a structured phonics program. So if you have such clear research, why is it that structured phonics programs are either not done that often, or when they are there, as they are in the basals, to a great extent, teachers don't spend as much time on them? And I think there's two reasons for that. One, phonics does not produce comprehension. And in the past, when teachers did a lot of phonics, and Reading First, for example, called for much more phonics and much more fluency, but teachers found that teaching phonics didn't necessarily produce more comprehension. And that, of course, in a way, makes sense, because phonics does not guarantee comprehension. Being able to decode with accuracy and automaticity does not mean you can comprehend what you read. You cannot comprehend what you read if you can't decode with accuracy and automaticity. But automaticity does not guarantee comprehension. Comprehension involves growing vocabulary, growing knowledge, and becoming familiar with how to read text, which can't be done without Accumaticity. So because phonics does not guarantee comprehension, many teachers dropped it, and many programs dropped it. The second reason was the sense that phonics is dry and dull and boring, and decodables are not authentic text, and for that reason, many people did not want to do it. Phonics does not have to be boring or dry. Nothing that we teach children has to be boring and dry. That's a matter of how we teach it. Phonics can incorporate games and music and acting and drama. I'm not sure about drama, but can certainly incorporate games and music and songs in very similar to the way Lorraine was talking about with Fluency. In fact, there are new phonics programs coming out now. An interesting one by Expeditionary Learning that will be available in September that has a K-2 structured phonics program that looks more like a Broadway musical than it does anything else. So for all those reasons, we have not paid the attention that is needed to phonics, and that means having a structured phonics program where, again, there's a sequence of phonics that are taught over a period of time. Students have lessons with those phonics, which can be all kinds of games and music, etc. And also they read decodables. Decodables don't have to be the only thing they read, but they read decodables that have the spelling sound patterns that they've learned. So if they've learned short A, they read books that have short A. If they learn short E, they read books that have short E, etc., that have predominantly the spelling sound patterns that have been learned. Okay, next slide. The importance of getting kids fluent before grade 3. In grade 3, to some extent in grade 2, but especially by grade 3, text becomes more complex. More complex text, especially now in the era of the Common Core, means more multisyllabic words and more longer sentences. So students who are disfluent are going to have way more problems with that kind of text than students who enter the 3rd grade and are already fluent. Disfluency takes the joy out of reading. If you're disfluent, by the time you're in the 3rd grade, you've been wrestling with text, you've been reading slower, you've noticed that other kids do not read that slower, you've been making more mistakes, You notice that other kids might not make that more mistakes. If you're struggling with something, it's hard for that to be joyful. And finally, if a student is disfluent, they don't say to themselves, I have a fluency problem. They say to themselves, I can't read. But in our country, and probably in most, if the student says to themselves they can't read, they think they're stupid. So if you're disfluent, you come to the 3rd grade and you don't love reading and you think you're stupid. That's a prescription for failure. Next slide, please. Okay, a brief mention on time. Research shows that students in K-2 require 45 to 60 minutes per day of foundational skills, and that includes concepts of print, phonics, and fluency. And we don't have as much research on time as we'd like, but we have at least 3 studies showing that schools that had this amount of time devoted to phonics and fluency and concepts of print in the early grades clearly outperform in every measure of reading schools that did not. And we don't have a lot of schools now that are producing, that have foundational skills programs for 45 to 60 minutes a day. There are some new ones on the market now, fortunately, but we have not had many of those. And that's why we get the results, one of the reasons why we get the results from David Page's work, showing that such huge numbers of students have low words correct per minute, low automaticity, so that they can't possibly read grade level text. Another sense of time. In a 10th grade history class in Louisiana, a teacher working with David Page, well, many history classes in high school are required to teach primary sources. Kids who are disfluent cannot read primary sources. Most teachers read the sources through them. This teacher working with David decided that they would read the actual primary sources, but they would use the kinds of instructional methods that Lorraine talked about. Repeated reading, the teacher would read it, the students would follow along, they would read it together. In one trimester, these students went from, I believe, in the low 20s on fluency scores based on national norms to the 90th percentile in one trimester. And that's why fluency is a low-hanging fruit. Fluency can be fixed, and it can be fixed essentially within a year, if not less than a year. Okay, next slide, please.
Okay, so here's where we are going to give you a chance to be interactive and really reflect on what you've heard so far and some of the great ideas that David and Lorraine have shared. So if you would use the question box, remember to indicate what grade band you're considering. What do you think might be a doable thing to start immediately or consider planning working immediately? So go ahead and use the question box, and we'll give you a couple minutes to put your comments in. Okay, so lots of great ideas, lots of love for the Reader's Theater. I also was really excited to hear about this. A lot of people considering multiple reads for the first time. It looks like particularly in the elementary schools, songs, poems, lots and lots of great things with exclamation points and tons of enthusiasm. So that is wonderful. Okay, so next section we're going to talk a bit about the resources that we have to support this work.
Okay, these sources are on Achieve the Core. And let's start with the top one, the Structured Phonics on the Aligned blog. The Aligned blog has a paper that I wrote with David Page about why structured phonics. It goes into the research that I cited. But not only does it go into the research I cited in detail, and you can see the graphs and you can see the data for yourselves, but it also gives a more complete explanation of exactly what a structured phonics program is, exactly how you could implement it, and it gives some examples of structured phonics programs that are currently available, some completely for free, that you can take a look at. So the whole question of why structured phonics, why more time on phonics, what phonics is, how to teach phonics, how to assess it, is all on that blog. And there's two versions of it. There's, one version is much shorter that you can take a look at. And if that whets your appetite, there's a link to the actual paper, which is much longer because it includes all of the data and all of the information. And that addresses the whole issue of K-2 and how you can produce automaticity in K-2 so that when students reach the third grade, their work with fluency will be much more productive because it'll be much easier to make them fluent readers because they'll essentially be very close, if not there, already. There's also an entire fluency section on Achieve the Core, and that goes into in much more detail than we're able to do in a webinar. What exactly is fluency? What exactly is disfluency? How do you assess fluency? And it gives you national norms so that when you do an assessment of a child and you come to them and you see that, well, they're reading 80 words correct per minute in, let's say, the second grade, then you can see, well, is that the average in second grade based on hundreds of thousands of students that have been assessed, or is 80 words correct per minute too low? So you can get a result of exactly what the Accumaticity level should be for students in each grade, and that is broken down into the fall, the winter, and the spring. And all of those resources are on the Fluency resources on Achieve the Core. What is fluency? How do you assess it? How do you teach it? And how do you work with students at all grade levels to be able to do that? Fluency packets. Fluency packets come from a school. I started a school with two other teachers, one of whom was my wife. And that was around 1990, before there were any charter schools. We actually started a regular public school because I'm so old. There were no charter schools then. And when we started working with Fluency, we created something called the Fluency Packet for the second grade. Each week, students got a packet. Well, each month they got a packet, and there was a reading for each week. And it was usually a funny poem or a funny story, something like Lorraine mentioned Jack Streletsky, or that kind of work that kids really like. And the teacher would take that text and read it out loud, and the students would follow along. And maybe the teacher would read it out loud twice, and then they would do choral reading. And the technique of choral reading, as well as every fluency technique, is explained on the Fluency resources on Achieve the Core. So the students would do some choral reading the first day, and that would take maybe 15 to 20 minutes. Then the second day, they might do some more choral reading, or they might do a echo reading, where one student reads, what a teacher reads, and the student repeats what this teacher read. So they had activities like that on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, but every night they also took the text home and they read it to their parents. We weren't asking the parents to teach them how to read. All they had to do was listen to the student read it out loud. And then the parent or the guardian or an older sibling would sign off and would say something like, Jose read this, it sounded great. Or Alicia read this, she struggled a little at the end, but I think she'll be better tomorrow. And they would go home every night with that. On Wednesday, after more choral reads, the students who were most proficient, the best with the most fluency, would come to the front of the class and they would read the text out loud to the rest of the class. And when they finished, they got a rousing ovation. On Thursday, the same thing happened, but that would be the students who were a little bit less fluent or less proficient because they needed that extra day and that extra night of taking it home. And by Friday, the students who were most fluent at the beginning and needed the most support, they would come up and they would read the text out loud to the class. And at that point, they'd read that text maybe 45 or 50 times. So no matter how disfluent they might have been, they were brilliant on Friday when they stood up and they read that and got a rousing ovation from everybody in the class. After a period of time, it could be 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, depending on the teacher and the class, you could jazz that up. And you could do also some of the things that Lorraine mentioned. So you could read it in voices, like read it like a witch, read it like a rap star, read it like a grandfather, read it like a grandmother. Or you could come up with your friends and alternate sentences. One child reads the first sentence, next child reads the second, then you switch off, which is really hard to do. And you could really make it into this kind of joyful activity. That was the Fluency packet, which is completely explained on our website. However, since we were putting it on a website, we could not get everything, the kinds of text that I think were most optimal, like those Prelutsky poems and funny poems and songs and things like that, because we would have had to pay permissions and it would have cost a fortune. You don't have that problem in an individual school. You're not putting it out on a website. You're just using it in your class or in your school. So I suggest the process is the same. On our Fluency packet, we had to use text that we didn't need to get permissions for, so they had to be more than 75 years old. So there was some good stuff. There were some old poems that were great, but there wasn't as much as if you didn't have to worry about that. But the process for the Fluency packet is exactly the same as laid out on our website. When our children reached the 3rd grade, there was no one who was disfluent. And the reason, that doesn't mean they all passed the reading test, because remember, fluency does not guarantee comprehension. Lack of fluency pretty much guarantees lack of comprehension, and especially with complex text. But all of those students were fluent, which of course gave them a much greater chance of becoming completely proficient readers. And the reason for that is they had the Fluency packet, they had the lessons, they had the repetition. 99% of human beings can be fluent readers, even in a language that's difficult to learn to read, such as English. So there's no reason that someone should reach the 3rd grade without being fluent. If you have the right kind of phonics program, K-2, and the right kind of fluency program afterwards, I guarantee you, you will have all of your students, or virtually all, completely fluent.
So I just have to make a comment about what you just said, David, because I think it was my last year of teaching. I was very curious as to what was the greatest indicator of how many students in our school, grades 3 and 4 were our tested grades, how many of those students passed the end of grade reading test. And I looked to see which had a greater correlation, their fluency score or their, all the hours and hours and hours that we would do with trying to get a kid onto a level text. Like what level were they? And honestly, the fluency was a greater indicator. It was so interesting to me, that 1 minute effort of knowing where they were as reading. It was, and you're right, they didn't all pass it. But it totally proves, you can do it with your own classroom. It proves that students, when they're fluent, they have a greater chance of comprehending. So one of the resources that I wanted to share with you is that Edward Fry made a list of words that students can read, because I think the 500 words account for something like 60 or 65% of the words that students read. So learning those words is a really great thing. And what Tim Rosinski did with Edward Fry's instant word list, he made an instant phrase list, which is part of the resources that are available to you today. And he put them into phrases so they're more meaningful. So it might be something like in the puddle, at the store, instead of just reading at the, in the. There are some words there that make it actually fun to read. You read them aloud with your students. If you have like 1st and 2nd graders that you're trying to get to fluency, even 3rd graders that are struggling with, really agonizing over every word, they read them over and over again. One of the things that we did, we wrote them on popsicle sticks and put them in a fry container so that they were Fry's phrases. It's a little corny, but it was fun. And it helped us to remember the importance of those words. And the kids, when they had extra time, they would just pull the phrases out and practice reading them with a friend. Another thing is just remembering that your greatest resource are those complex texts. And speeches are a fabulous way to have students develop empathy for the speaker, to develop that really strong academic vocabulary that is so characteristic of beautifully written pieces of literature like Chief Joseph's speech. As I mentioned before, I love John F. Kennedy's, going to the moon. And even if you just take a section of a speech and have the students practice that over and over again, you're also developing their cultural literacy, helping them to assign these beautiful thoughts and words to specific people.
So we're running a little bit short on time, and so I'm going to just pull out a couple of the questions that we've already received a lot of, and then, excuse me, hopefully David and Lorraine can respond to some questions. I'll send them that we've gotten, because we've gotten a lot of really great questions throughout. One thing that I've seen a lot of people asking, David or Lorraine, is about the DIBELS assessment, and what you guys think about that as a measurement of fluency. They have nonsense words. Any reactions to that?
There's a lot of assessments like DIBELS, and they work. You're going to get a sense of, DIBELS doesn't always, well, it never measures expression. When you're assessing fluency, it's good to get words correct per minute plus expression. But that's okay. The words correct per minute as Accumaticity is essential. Yes, you can, DIBELS works, and there are other ones that work. There's no doubt about that. The question is, you have to act on it. And students who perform poorly are likely going to need a lot more time and attention than you've been giving them.
And another quick question, and then we'll send you guys the rest of the questions in the follow-up. Is there a difference in working in fluency with fiction versus nonfiction text?
Lorraine, you want to answer that?
Sure. I have found that working with fiction feels like a more natural way of working on the expressive part. But there's some really beautifully written nonfiction. And when you find those really beautiful, complex, except the exemplar texts, and you read through those and realize what beautifully written informational text. I used to tell my students when they were reading an informational text aloud to imagine that they were on Animal Planet or Discovery Channel, and they were trying to get other people excited about the topic. So there is obviously a difference. You can't speak in different voices and all of that, but we want those to be communicated effectively too.
All right, I'm going to just ask one more question at the end, and I think it's a hard one, and then we'll wrap it up. And I'm sorry for going a little bit late, but this has gotten a lot of really great engagement. So a lot of people asking questions about special education students, particularly those that have been trained in like Wilson reading, so that they can sound out like one word at a time, but very difficult to transfer that to fluency where you're looking at words together. Any quick reactions to that, or we can save that for a more in-depth response?
The process is the same. The students who are in a program where they're, I'm not sure which, I'm pretty sure I know what program you're talking about, but and they're reading words, but they're not reading fluently in a text. They need fluency work. They need the kind of activities that Lorraine said. It goes back to what I said earlier. Automaticity or Accumaticity does not guarantee fluency. A student can decode at the right rate and with enough accuracy, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're a fluent reader. They need to do the kinds of fluency activities that Lorraine called for. So you have this chain. Accumaticity is essential to fluency, but it's not sufficient. It doesn't mean that you're going to be fluent. Fluency is essential to comprehension, but it's not sufficient. It doesn't mean that you're going to be able to comprehend. So you've got this whole chain, and if the chain breaks at any point, the child can't read. But the children who come out of a Wilson program that have not had any fluency, which they should have in that program, but if they come out of that not having it, the range of activities that she described are what they need.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we already went through this, so we'll skip this slide in interest of time. I just want to remind you all that all these great ideas that you're doing. The way we measure our impact of these webinars and so on is for you to share with us what you've tried, what you've done, and so we've created this really short form, achievethecore.org, educators taking action, so that you can share with us the great work that you are carrying forward out of this webinar. We want to just give a quick shout out for those of you who are still on and interested that we're working on a book baskets project, and one of the things that we're working on is creating titles of books to create around a topic to help support building knowledge and so on through text. And so on this webinar, when you get the live links, and you'll get the entire webinar, if you could share your favorite topic, then we can start building lists of books that we are really excited to share with you as some of the work that we're doing on platforms such as Pinterest, Facebook, and Twitter. So your ideas will be really helpful for us making a useful collection of titles. Finally, a little shout out for upcoming webinars. Some of you may know that next month is our annual Core Advocate convening. Actually, the day it starts 2 days before. The webinar will be 2 days before. So what we're going to do is encourage you all to watch one of our past popular webinars. We have Causes of the Achievement Gap that David Lieben presented last year, as well as Rigor in Math, Why Rigor Doesn't Mean Harder. And then during the time of our webinar on May 3rd from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time, we're going to have some live Twitter chats around those two core advocates using these two hashtags, core advocates, and either an ELA one or a math hashtag. So we encourage you all to engage in that conversation. So thank you all for hanging on with us. 250 strong. That was an awesome turnout, and thank you so much to David and Lorraine for your great information.